Story 1. I own 3 properties, and 2 of them I rent out on Airbnb. The third one is my personal home in Montreal, where I live full-time. The story I am about to share happened at one of my rental properties located in Wakefield, Quebec. It is a cozy little house tucked away in the woods, exactly as advertised. The place has 2 bedrooms, but it is designed more with couples in mind because of its size. Sometimes, though, larger groups of 4 or more rent it out. Those are the bookings that keep me on edge since bigger groups have a tendency to cause more damage. Couples, on the other hand, are generally considerate. They usually leave the place in decent condition, and I trust my cleaning lady to handle it after they leave. However, when a larger group rents the house, I prefer to check on it myself to make sure nothing was damaged or stolen. It is about a 2-hour drive, and if I go, I often stay the night to save myself the trouble of driving back the same day. This particular trip was after a larger group had stayed there for the weekend. I decided to head over, clean up, and inspect the place. Before heading out, I texted my closest neighbor in Wakefield to let him know I was visiting for the day. Like me, he does not spend much time there, but whenever I visit, I check in to see if he needs me to bring anything, like his mail or packages. He replied quickly and said he would not be up that week. He also asked if I could check for any mail from a specific person. On my way, I stopped at his property first. As I walked to his mailbox, I noticed footprints in the snow leading alongside his house. This caught my attention. I opened the mailbox, but it was just junk mail, credit card offers and the like. I texted him to let him know there was no mail from the person he mentioned and also told him about the footprints. The tracks were odd because they did not come from the road or the driveway. Instead, they emerged from the woods, went to his window, and then wrapped around to the back of his house. He immediately called me and asked me to follow the tracks to see where they led. I walked around his property, following the footprints as they disappeared back into the woods on the opposite side of his house. He seemed unconcerned, saying, "As long as they did not break in, I do not care." With that, I headed to my property, which was just a minute or so up the hill. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was a lot of footprints around my rental house. The last guests had left a couple of days earlier, and it had snowed since then, so it was strange that the tracks were still so clear. Fresh snow was expected that evening, so I figured they would be gone by the next day. I got straight to work, starting with changing the code on the front door's security lock for the next visitors. Once inside, I saw the place was in a state. The sink was piled high with dirty dishes and glasses, the trash bin was overflowing, and empty cans of soda and beer were scattered everywhere. Some guests assume the cleaning fee means they can leave the house in any condition they please. As I cleaned, I triple-checked to make sure nothing had been stolen. I had music playing while I worked, but even over the sound, I suddenly heard something from outside. My property is isolated, up on a hill surrounded by woods, so nobody should have been around. I turned off the music and listened closely. There were footsteps in the snow, moving past one of the windows and heading towards the backyard. I made sure the front door was locked and then sat quietly in the living room, waiting. Whoever was out there had to know someone was home since my car was parked right in front of the house. For 20 minutes, I stayed as still as possible, listening. When I finally gathered the courage, I stepped outside to investigate. Sure enough, there was a fresh trail of footprints circling the house. I followed them all the way around, but they seemed to stop or overlap near the back of the house, right by the window air conditioning unit. I looked out towards the woods, feeling a strong sense that someone was out there watching me. The unease was overwhelming, so I went back inside and locked the doors. I decided I was not going to step outside again that day. Instead, I pulled out my phone after finishing the cleaning and laundry. I ordered a ridiculous amount of food on Grubhub. It felt like forever before it finally arrived, so by the time it got there, it ended up being both my late lunch and dinner. Once I had eaten, I spent the rest of my day working remotely on my laptop. The snow had started falling again, and it looked like it would continue all night. I figured this would probably bring in a few bookings over the next couple of days. The cozy vibe of the house, especially in the snow, always seemed to attract people. By the time I finished working, it was about 8 o'clock in the evening. I decided to relax and put on a movie. As I watched, I started hearing strange creaks and cracks coming from the ceiling. I had never noticed those sounds before, and since there was no attic, it felt a little strange. My only guess was that it might be the weight of the fresh snow on the roof. I tried not to overthink it and focused on the movie. After the movie ended, I headed to bed. The sound of snowflakes lightly tapping against the windowsill was incredibly calming. For a while, I let myself enjoy the peacefulness, but then that eerie sound of footsteps in the snow returned. My stomach sank. It was late at night, and the realization that someone was outside again sent a chill down my spine. The footsteps passed by my window, then faded into the distance. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of movement, anything that might signal someone trying to break in. I was in a heightened state of awareness, ready to switch into full defense mode at the slightest noise. After about 20 minutes of silence, I decided I could not just sit there anymore. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and armed myself with a baseball bat before stepping outside. The snow was crisp under my feet as I walked around the house, scanning for anything unusual. Sure enough, there was a fresh trail of footprints in the snow again. This time, the trail started near the window air conditioning unit and led off towards the woods. A terrible thought crossed my mind: someone had likely been on my roof earlier. It dawned on me that they might have climbed up and down using the AC unit as a step. Feeling both unnerved and angry, I went back inside and called the police. A Wakefield police officer arrived about 20 minutes later. He was professional and reassuring as we checked around the property together. He even climbed up onto the roof to investigate and confirmed my suspicions. There were footprints up there that clearly indicated someone had been walking around. The officer tried to put me at ease, saying he would stay in the area for the night in case anything happened. I also told him about the similar footprints I had seen at my neighbor's house earlier in the day, just to give him a heads up in case this person, or group of people, was targeting multiple homes for some unknown reason. As he left, the officer reminded me to call right away if I heard or saw anything else suspicious. His presence gave me a bit of comfort, and I managed to get some rest that night. By the next morning, the snow had blanketed the tracks from the night before, and I decided it was time to head back to Montreal. I rented out the property to another group of guests a few days later. Thankfully, they did not report anything unusual during their stay. Looking back, it has been over a year since that night, and nothing like it has happened again. I am grateful it turned out to be an isolated incident, but it is something I will never forget. Story 2. This happened back when I was a kid, staying home alone for one of the first times. I was in 7th grade. My parents had recently decided I was old enough to be left on my own, and I usually just spent that time playing video games. One night, while my parents were out doing whatever they did, I was in the basement, completely absorbed in a game. Now, our basement was where the video games were kept because my dad did not want them cluttering up the living room, and it was a space my older brother and I shared. It was a big basement, but as kids, it always gave us the creeps. Whenever we had to go upstairs, we would switch off the lights and sprint like something terrifying was chasing us. Even at 12 years old, those memories still stuck with me, and I could not help but glance over my shoulder when I was down there alone, especially at night. So there I was, playing my game, when suddenly, bang! Something slammed against the basement window. I practically jumped out of my skin and spun around to look. It sounded like a fist hitting the glass. Outside, it was dark and snowing, the clouds blotting out any moonlight. I saw some snow sticking to the window and figured maybe an icicle had fallen and hit it. Shrugging it off, I turned back to my game. But before I could get fully immersed again, another loud bang echoed through the basement. This time, I got up and walked over to the window for a closer look. More snow was scattered across the glass. That is when it clicked, someone was outside throwing snowballs at the window. Naturally, I thought it had to be my older brother, Jake, messing with me. I went upstairs, opened the backyard door, and peered out through the glass storm door. The brick wall to the left blocked most of my view, so I stepped outside in just a pair of slides. The cold wind and snow bit at my face as I walked down the steps to ground level. I called out, "Jake! Why did you not tell me you were coming home tonight?" That is when I saw someone crouching in the bushes near the back fence, trying to hide. "Jake, I see you," I said, laughing nervously. But as I kept staring, a chill, not from the weather, ran down my spine. Something about their posture, the way they were hiding, made me question if it was really him. Heart pounding, I bolted back inside and locked the door. I grabbed the phone and called my mom. "Is Jake supposed to be home tonight?" I asked. She said no, he was staying at a friend's house. My stomach dropped. Before I could even explain what was happening, another thud hit the window. "Mom, did you hear that?" I whispered. She said yes and put me on speaker so my dad could listen. My dad asked if it could just be some kids playing a prank. I told him, "I don't know. It doesn't feel right." I was freaking out. "When are you coming home?" I begged. They said they were on their way and would be there soon. I mentioned that whoever it was probably knew I was home because I had stepped outside. My mom told me to go upstairs, lock my bedroom door, and stay there while she called the police. So, I did exactly that. I turned off my bedroom lights and sat in the dark, my eyes glued to the window. It was getting darker outside, but I could still see enough to make out movement in the yard. Someone was walking around, looking through the downstairs windows. They stopped at the kitchen window, the one they had thrown snowballs at earlier, and started knocking on it. They must have thought I was still in there since I had left the light on. The figure was tall, definitely not a little kid. They had on a thick jacket with the hood pulled up, so I could not tell how old they were, but they seemed older than a teenager. I watched in growing terror as they grabbed the window frame and tried to lift it. Thankfully, those windows had been locked for months because of the cold. But it was clear, they were trying to get inside. Then, they lifted their head and looked up toward the upstairs windows. As soon as the figure looked up toward the upstairs windows, I panicked and ducked down, making sure I was out of sight. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like they might hear it. I did not dare look out the window again. Moments later, I heard a thud, this time against my bedroom window. My stomach dropped. He must have seen me. A few more snowballs hit the glass, one after another. I sat there frozen, gripping the edge of my bed, praying it would stop. And then, just like that, it went silent. Not long after, my phone buzzed. It was my mom calling to check on me. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she was worried. "Are you okay?" she asked. I told her what had just happened. She reassured me that the police were on their way, but the storm might delay them. She stayed on the line with me for a bit, trying to keep me calm. It felt like an eternity before the doorbell finally rang. My heart leaped into my throat. I tiptoed downstairs, clutching the phone tightly, and peeked through the peephole. It was a police officer, a lone woman, probably in her 40s. She had a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. After confirming it was safe, I opened the door and let her in. She asked me a few quick questions before stepping out with her flashlight to inspect the property. I stayed inside, watching her through the windows as she moved methodically around the yard. She checked the bushes, the shed, and the patio, shining her light into every dark corner. When she finally came back to the front door, she gave me a small, reassuring nod. "There are footprints all over the yard," she said, "but whoever it was, they are gone now. You are safe." She spoke to my mom on the phone for a while, explaining what she had found. Afterward, she told me she would stay until my parents got home. That simple promise brought a wave of relief. Eventually, my parents arrived, and the officer left after making sure everything was fine. We locked every door and window, triple-checking each one. I was safe, but I could not shake the feeling of unease. Looking back, it might have just been some creepy prank or a messed-up joke by a stranger. But the way that person tried to open the window made me think it was more than that. If it was an attempted break-in, it was the most ridiculous attempt ever, throwing snowballs first to make sure I was aware of their presence. It just did not make sense. My gut tells me it was not about breaking in to steal something. It felt more sinister, like someone wanted to scare me, just for the sick thrill of it. A twisted individual trying to mess with a kid who was home alone. Story 3. Years ago, I went on a winter trip to the Colorado Rockies with my girlfriend, Sarah, my buddy Mark, and his girlfriend Emily. Mark and I have been close friends for as long as I can remember, and we share a love for outdoor adventures, whether it is hiking, snowboarding, or climbing mountains. Mark's family owns a cozy cabin out there, so we planned to stay for a couple of nights. We picked a weekend when the forecast promised snow, hoping to make the most of the winter wonderland. When we arrived at the cabin, the ground was already covered with a soft layer of snow, and more was expected the following day. That first night, we decided to kick back and relax. We all jumped into the hot tub with glasses of wine in hand. The cabin is tucked away deep in the woods, so there was nothing but peace, quiet, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Light snowflakes were drifting down as we soaked in the warm water under the night sky, a gentle hint of the weather to come. The next morning, we woke up to see a thin veil of snow falling outside. It was not as heavy as the forecast had suggested, but we stayed optimistic, hoping it would pick up as the day went on. Mark, always the one with a plan, decided to fuel up the quad that his family kept in a large shed behind the cabin. It had been sitting idle for a while, so we had to jump-start it with my truck. Once it roared to life, we took turns riding it around the trails on Mark's sprawling property. His land was a mix of wide-open spaces perfect for doing donuts and sharp, twisting trails that snaked through the woods. We spent hours out there. The foggy air made everything feel a bit surreal, and although it was snowing, it was just a light dusting at first. Mark and Emily rode the quad together while Sarah and I grabbed some sleds and tackled a massive hill on the property. We could not stop laughing as we slid down again and again, racing each other and wiping out in the snow. After a while, we decided to grab some lunch. I drove us in my pickup truck, which handled the snowy roads like a champ. When we returned to the cabin, Sarah and Emily were ready for a nap, but Mark and I were not about to waste the daylight. We geared up for a hike, layering on jackets and pulling on our heavy boots. One of the quad trails led up into the mountains, and we were curious to see how far it would take us. The hike started off easy enough, but as we climbed higher, the snow got deeper, and the trail became steeper. Mark and I are both in great shape, so we were up for the challenge, but it was the kind of trek that could wear out anyone who was not used to it. The cold air stung our faces, and our boots crunched through the snow as we pressed on. After what felt like close to an hour, we reached a spot near the top of the mountain. On a clear day, it probably would have been a breathtaking view, but all we could see was a wall of white from the fog and swirling snow. We sat down to rest, the snow now falling much harder, just as the forecast had predicted. I could not help but ask Mark for the third time, "You sure you know how to get back?" He gave me a confident nod and assured me that he did. Trusting him, I followed as he led the way back down the mountain. By then, the light snow had turned into a full-on blizzard. We knew we needed to move quickly, but going downhill was thankfully much easier than climbing up. As we made our way down the mountain, something strange happened. Out of nowhere, I heard this low, moaning, humming kind of sound behind us. It sent a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks and told Mark to listen. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He shook his head and said he did not. We stood there, quiet, letting the snowfall muffle everything around us. Then we heard it again. The noise was strange, a rumbling, almost human-like moaning sound. It was coming from somewhere not far behind us. Mark turned to me, his face dead serious, and I could see he was starting to feel uneasy too. "What is that?" I asked him, and he just shook his head again, saying he had no idea. We picked up our pace, hurrying down the trail, but then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was an echo of ours, but no, these footsteps were distinct, following us. I stopped again, grabbed Mark's arm, and whispered, "Do you hear that?" This time, he nodded. The woods were eerily silent. Snowfall tends to make everything quieter, so it was easy to hear the crunch of snow under someone's feet. But in the thick fog and dense trees, we could not see a thing. Mark finally muttered, "That is not an animal." No way. He was right, no animal would follow us like that, especially with all the noise we were making. My heart was pounding when I suddenly felt my phone vibrate in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, relieved for the distraction, and saw a string of messages from Sarah. Apparently, they had been trying to reach me, but the texts must have come through all at once because I had no service until that moment. As I walked, I pulled off a glove to reply. Sarah's messages made my stomach drop. She was asking if it was Mark and me outside the cabin and said they were scared to leave the room. My fingers were freezing, and the snow made it hard to type, but I managed to respond, "What do you mean?" The message never delivered. I tried calling, but the signal was gone again. I turned to Mark and explained what Sarah had said. "We need to get back, fast," I told him. At that point, the strange humming and moaning sound started up again, still close behind us. We broke into a run, pushing through the snow as the sky grew darker. My heart was racing as we finally spotted the lights of the cabin flickering through the woods. We reached the cabin and banged on the door. Sarah and Emily let us in, both of them looking pale and shaken. They started talking over each other, trying to explain what had happened. From what they told us, they had seen two figures walking around outside about 10 minutes earlier. One of them even stopped and looked in through the window. Terrified, they stayed hidden in one of the rooms and waited for us to come back. Mark immediately went to his dad's room and grabbed a gun. We made sure all the blinds were shut, locking every door and window. The tension in the room was thick, but we still had plans to go out for dinner. Mark and I decided to head outside first to check things out. He carried the gun, and we scanned the area quickly before calling Sarah and Emily out to the truck. We did not mention the sounds we had heard in the woods, it would only scare them more. Dinner at the diner was quiet and uneasy. We ate quickly and returned to the cabin, skipping the hot tub entirely. Instead, we decided to watch a movie together to distract ourselves. But the peace did not last long. A loud, aggressive knock at the door interrupted us. Everyone froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. I could see the fear on Sarah and Emily's faces. Mark grabbed the gun, loaded it, and stood by the door. The knock came again. Mark whispered, "Should I say something? Should I tell them I have a gun?" I shook my head. "No, just stay quiet." Whoever was outside never knocked a third time. We waited in silence for what felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. Sarah and Emily eventually went to bed, but Mark and I stayed in the living room, keeping watch. Neither of us wanted to take any chances. We made it through the night without any more incidents. The next morning, we packed up, eager to leave. As we cleaned up and put things away, Mark and I decided to check for footprints around the cabin. What we found was nothing. No tracks in the snow at all. It was possible that the new snowfall had covered everything, but something about it did not sit right with me. Whatever had been out there that night, it was not normal. And I knew deep down that we were lucky to leave that place unscathed.